Pessoal, boa noite a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos à nossa 28ª edição do nosso encontro, nosso Meetup virtual da C3, Comunidade de Ciências Comportamentais, em parceria com a Rede Bsb-EConomics de Brasília. Estamos aqui, Flávia, Juliana, Guilherme e eu. Mais uma vez, um convidado super especial, Zarak Khan. Mais uma vez, de modo virtual, o evento está sendo gravado e vai ser publicado em nosso canal no YouTube. E sem mais delongas, passo a palavra para a Flávia para introduzir o nosso convidado.
Olá, pessoal, boa noite. Então, estamos aqui com um convidado muito especial, né? Todos são bastante, mas Zarak aí vai falar de um tema que tenho certeza que brilha os olhos aí já há alguns anos de alguns de vocês, e imagino que vai ganhar cada vez mais espaço, que é como ciências comportamentais aí implementar nas organizações, tá? Ele é pesquisador comportamental sênior aí no Center for Advanced Hindsight e professor da Pensilvânia, onde ele ensina, estuda ciências comportamentais, e ele é um cientista comportamental aí experiente em generar e aplicar esses insights dentro de organizações, experimentos, inovação, infraestrutura. Inclusive foi citado aí pela própria McKinsey num artigo como um dos cientistas aí nessa área de destaques. E tem aí, vai falar um pouco para a gente também da experiência dele estar coordenando aí, ser parte de um board também, que é um board especializado aí, o Action Design Network, para difundir essa área no mundo todo, né? Então, falando, colocando a tecla SAP aqui rapidinho, e passando para ele, Zarak Khan, very welcome, Zarak, very nice to have you here. And I'm going to let them know a little bit about your bio. So Zarak is a behavioral scientist with experience in generating and applying insights to organizational strategy, innovation, infrastructure, product design, public policy, process improvement, and program management. He was cited by McKinsey Company as an expert for the future of behavioral science. And he is one of the leaders, the organizers of a book that names Building Behavioral Science in an Organizations, that brings a lot of lessons from practitioners on establishing behavioral science function in different opportunities. So just a little bit about a huge bio that he has, and he's going to share with us his experience and some insights for everyone that's trying to build and apply this area here in Brazil. Zarak, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Flávia. Hola, obrigado to everyone. Thank you for having me. I am excited to chat with you all, especially because, it's always fun to talk with folks who are also practitioners and, have, developed expertise in behavioral science and are using it in a variety of different ways. So, I think that the way that our kind of conversation will go today is I'll share a few slides, and it's really kind of based on the book that we just published that focuses really on kind of building behavioral science in an organization. And then we'll have a conversation about it. So I also welcome any feedback just sort of on the presentation itself. I mean, the topic is, the book just came out a couple of months ago. So the topic is kind of a new one for me to be talking about. So if there are things that you find particularly interesting or things that are confusing, feel free to let me know, and I can work on that for future talks that I give too. So with that, I might share my screen and share a few slides. All right, can everyone see that first slide that says building behavioral science in an organization? Great.
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. Everyone's very responsive there, I appreciate it. Sometimes it's like people don't know that you can see them, right? So they're just expecting somebody else to say yes. So I appreciate the responsive group. Cool. So, the book was written by a bunch of different people. So I was one of the co-editors of it. along with a colleague of mine, Laurel Newman. And there were lots of people who contributed based on their expertise. So, you know, there were folks who knew more about product management or, you know, market research or marketing, or had run or built different types of teams. So this is kind of the list of people who contributed to sort of the first version of this. But I would also love to thank Flávia and the team here for kind of supporting this effort as well. So this is really kind of what the book and then this talk sort of kind of presupposes. So the idea is that, you know, if you're reading this book, you probably already know the basics of behavioral science, right? So this isn't really one of those talks where it's like, whoa, brains are crazy and look at all these weird decisions that people make. You know, this is kind of with the understanding that everyone here probably knows all that already. And you're looking to sort of incorporate behavioral science more into what you or your organization does. So what it does cover is sort of, why do organizations use behavioral science? Where do they use it? And then how do they use it? So the why, well, I'll kind of go through relatively quickly. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time here kind of talking through the where and the how. So why do organizations use behavioral science? I think that they use behavioral science for kind of three primary reasons. And that's to improve insights, to improve internal decision making, and to improve the culture of the organization itself. So, you know, at its core, behavioral science is a methodology or a toolkit that helps us better understand our stakeholders. And those might be customers, they could be employees, could be partners, it could be citizens. But at the end of the day, you know, the people that we are looking to influence are people. And so behavioral science gives us the tools to uncover those insights about how people actually behave, right? So not how they are sort of necessarily would behave to maximize economic utility, but how they actually behave in sort of their nuanced psychological glory. And the improvement to these insights are material, measurable improvements to products, services, policies that translate to higher revenue, lower costs, fewer product misfires, better experiences, and just a higher performing organization overall. Beyond just sort of the insights, behavioral science helps leaders make better choices, informed by calculated risk assessment and tested assumptions. The practice itself of employing behavioral science forces managers and leaders to be precise when defining goals, and really isolate exactly what are the behaviors and the measurable outcomes that matter most in determining, you know, a successful project or a successful venture. And the clarity of strategy and that sort of precision around the focus is, I often think of it as kind of just a very valuable side effect of kind of beginning that behavioral science journey. You know, when leaders are acting, you know, and putting in place the processes of designing experiments and identifying, you know, the data sources that we need to measure relevant outcomes, we often uncover barriers that we hadn't seen before, that, you know, improve the product or the service itself. And then when you have a system in place that allows you to rapidly test different ideas, you know, behavioral science helps leaders make quicker decisions based on a broader array of choices. And that habit of experimentation prompts us to continually test new ideas, even when the status quo is doing pretty well. So, you know, it's this mindset that we can always be testing and improving and things can always be better. And a behaviorally informed organization really embraces behavioral science as a verb, where it's sort of the process of applying behavioral science and testing and measuring, as opposed to a noun of just sort of, I'm going to, you know, pick loss aversion. I'm going to pick anchoring and sort of toss it into products or services or policies and kind of hope that things, are improved. And when you sort of treat it as this process, you change the culture of your organization as well. It empowers people to not just be sort of workers, but to be explorers. You're sort of identifying and pushing the boundaries of science and new things that your organization could be doing. And then, for one of the things that I like, just kind of from having a background in innovation, is that it democratizes the innovation across an organization. So, a lot of times sort of the kind of old school way of innovation, right, is that you have ideas kind of from the top, and those are the ideas that we pursue. But when you have a culture and infrastructure that supports experimentation, good ideas can come from anywhere, and we sort of test them out to see which ones do the best. So that's kind of my overview of why I think organizations use behavioral science. And now we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about, once an organization sort of says, okay, this is something that I think is interesting, where do they typically use it? And this is not at all a comprehensive list, but these are just 4 common areas of application. And we cover a couple more in the book itself. But these are the ones that, just sort of for the sake of time and stuff, I've kind of combined a few. And these are the ones that I kind of see as sort of the most frequently used. So consulting and operations kind of focused on internal processes, building and selling products and services, so kind of product management, marketing, market research, HR and employee engagement. So when we're sort of turning behavioral science kind of the lens internally and changing the behavior of folks within our own organizations, and then innovation when we're trying to do something new. I'll quickly note that the language that I'll use kind of shifts across this presentation. So sometimes I'll say companies, sometimes I'll say organizations or consumers or users. The insights or the sort of lessons here are kind of broadly applicable to most big organizations. I would say the one kind of category that would probably need some special kind of attention or additional sort of tweaking would be like government policy teams. And there's kind of been a lot written about different government policy teams, but a lot of this will still even kind of translate to that environment as well. So let's jump in and talk a bit about consulting and operations. So there are 3 primary ways that I think behavioral science can improve or be integrated into a consulting function within an organization. And those 3 are, first, kind of providing a behavioral framework for understanding a problem and designing a solution to solve that problem. Defining the problem that you end up working on from a behavioral perspective, and then assessing the impact of the solutions that you end up providing. So consultancies are driven by frameworks that give some initial clarity and guidance on how to solve problems. And frameworks can cover both processes, so that's kind of like, what are the steps that we're going to take to solve a problem, as well as sort of conceptual frameworks. So what are the ideas that we're going to use, that we're going to kind of bring to bear when we're solving a problem. And incorporating behavioral science into both of these can be useful. So both when you're kind of walking a partner through, the diagnosis of what you're going to do, as well as when you're designing potential solutions. Adding a behavioral scientist to the diagnosis phase should lead to a more comprehensive understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve. And a behavioral scientist accomplishes this in a variety of ways, but it likely includes framing the problem that you're working on as a set of key behaviors that can be influenced, going beyond the sort of surveys and focus groups and sort of stated preference methods of research to review behavioral or administrative data that can show someone's kind of more true preference or action, and complement, sort of the stated preference. It's not necessarily a replacement for it, but can be a great complement to sort of say, well, this is what someone said that they wanted or said they were going to do, and then, this is what they actually did. And then finally, a greater emphasis on design and incentives within a broader system, as opposed to just focusing on independent decisions. And I think that, it's difficult to really overstate the importance of accurately diagnosing the problem that you're working on. I often think of like the quote, I think it's a real quote, but if not, it's just a good quote, so I kind of keep using it anyways. A lot of things get attributed to Albert Einstein, and so it's like, did he really say all this? But the quote is, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. And so, I think augmenting the standard set of diagnosis tools that you would use in a consultancy with a behavioral approach can ensure that the solutions that you end up coming up with are a better match to the actual problem. And then the last point here is just that, a lot of consultancies, when they are doing some sort of impact assessments, like what was the value of the solution that we provided, a lot of them don't do that at all, actually. And then if they do, it is usually like a pretty rudimentary kind of pre-post assessment. And so they don't really do much to establish a causal relationship between their solution and the thing that happened afterwards. And I mean, I would sort of exclude behavioral science consultancies from that. They sort of typically are, that's kind of part of what the value is, but a lot of just sort of management consulting or, consulting within an organization, they don't necessarily do that kind of impact evaluation or measurement. There are some things to just kind of keep in mind, though, with consulting. So typically a behavioral scientist will join to augment, or add to the efforts that are already existing. And so they're going to work next to project managers and data analysts and other consultants to improve the final deliverable. And so, if your organization is looking to more fully integrate behavioral science into consulting, you might first have a behavioral scientist review like the application and solution frameworks. So kind of going back to that first point on the last slide, it's often a pretty fruitful first step because so much of the nature and the process of the work stems from those documents. And so, it might help to have a behavioral scientist go through and say, oh, that this phase we do like a behavior mapping exercise, or this, in this phase we sort of plan for how we're going to measure the impact, or we run a pilot here. And so, that simple shift can kind of realign the way that, a lot of organizations approach projects and staff teams. And it also helps to avoid a pretty common pitfall, which is a lack of clarity on how is a behavioral scientist helping and like what are they doing that's different from other people on the team. And it becomes even more confusing when that team might include, like design thinking person or marketing person, or one of these sort of disciplines that draws on psychology as well. So to help alleviate that friction, it can be useful to have the first sort of behavioral scientist hire to the team develop, or co-develop clear processes and tools for that role, and sort of identify where they consult, where they participate in those engagements. I've also just sort of observed that behavioral scientists can be really valuable in client-facing interactions. So they can often help articulate the behaviors or sort of the psychology, the motivation behind why a user or a client might be doing something, and being able to sort of reference academic research can lend credibility to whatever approach you're suggesting. The main limitation with behavioral science and consulting is really kind of tied to just the main limitation of consulting itself, which is that nobody has to actually listen to what you say, right? So, we ran a really big survey of different behavioral science teams. I think we had over 500 responses from around the world. And we asked about sort of, what are the biggest challenges that you face and what do you do and all this stuff. And so for the consulting teams, basically we kind of divided them into two categories. One category was they're sort of an in-house consultancy and they consult within their own organization. And the other is, they're external facing and they work with sort of external clients. And so the main complaint with external facing teams was, well, we're never sure if anyone's actually listening to our advice and doing the things that we suggest. And the main complaint from the internal teams was just, well, we know they're not doing the things that we suggest because we all work together. So that can be, a challenge for that consulting environment. Bringing, hopefully bringing a behavioral scientist in sort of early in the process, even in like the business development sort of scoping phase can help make that a little bit more successful. The second of the four kind of big categories that we'll talk about here of sort of where organizations use behavioral science is in building and selling things. So this could be like products, services. I would include policies here as well. I mean, sort of creating and marketing policies or driving adoption for policies. There are four areas that a behavioral scientist can help with in sort of the building process of this. So the role here is almost what you would consider a behavioral product manager. So, a product manager's role is to oversee the research required to prioritize, design, and develop the features and the go-to-market strategy that is going to make a product successful. And doing this requires both a deep knowledge of the customer and of just the market itself. And so that is where, a behavioral scientist can help. So in the ideation phase, a behavioral scientist will go beyond just sort of, again, like kind of stated preference, so they'll augment that and take, a deeper look at like the customer psychology or the psychology of the user or citizen by doing a behavioral diagnosis that might include, collecting data about existing behaviors or doing a literature review of the space of what academics sort of said about it. It might include a behavior mapping process where you're sort of mapping out the environment in which people are making decisions to sort of understand the context and gain more ideas. And then this sort of dovetails with the research phase, which is after sort of doing this diagnosis, a behavioral scientist can partner with a product manager to narrow down the typically really long list of potential new things you could do. So, I often will hear that, when I go to like meet with a team, like, well, we don't have a shortage of ideas, we just don't have enough resources to do all of the things on the list. So, behavioral scientists can kind of help narrow down that list or help prioritize that list. Because behavioral scientists are typically, experts at isolating a key assumption or a key behavior and designing a prototype or a pilot or some kind of A/B test to see whether or not that assumption is true, and then sort of building from that. So, the value here is that a behavioral scientist can sort of move a team away from relying solely on intuition. I think there's still a lot of value in intuition, but you kind of don't want to just solely rely on that for product decisions, and bring a little bit more rigor to sort of the research and the testing to see like what's actually driving the key behaviors here. Excuse me. And then moving from research to design, we'll often hear product teams talk about sort of solutions, we're building solutions for this or that. And behavioral scientists would probably speak more in terms of behaviors. So what is like the uncomfortably specific behavior that you want to design a feature or a product around? So, if you're like an education startup, you might want people to finish your online courses, or if you're a health tech company, you might want somebody to log their daily exercise in your app. So, a behavioral scientist can help a product manager home in on this really specific behavior and then design the small ways, sort of the contextual nudges and that sort of thing to drive users or customers to that behavior. And then finally, in sort of the launch phase, a behavioral scientist will often work with engineering and the product manager to design the, kind of test and learn or prototype or some launch and learn rollout strategy. And so that is, relies a lot on sort of knowledge of statistics. So, this is where you're generating an experimental design. You're kind of isolating what are the hypotheses that you're testing with this, kind of pilot or this launch. What's the sample size and the conversion and effect size, and what's the duration and all that stuff that you need to kind of set up for the test. And it's often helpful to have this person sort of serve as a knowledge manager as well, or kind of develop the infrastructure to document what are the things that we're trying, and what are the things that have not worked or have been successful. Otherwise, you end up pretty quickly testing the same things over and over because you didn't realize that somebody else had already done it. And I remember talking with the product manager for experimentation at Yelp, and he had built sort of an infrastructure like this for their product. And he kind of made the point that, like, we hire lots of really smart people all the time, and they've all got a lot of great ideas, but nobody has an idea that we haven't already tried in like their first week. Everyone like has all these ideas when they come in of like, oh, we should try this or that. And it's helpful to have it documented that, well, we have tried that, and here's sort of what happened. So, the launch of this sort of product or service, or the introduction of a new policy leads pretty directly into the selling of that. How do you kind of market that? And, at its core, selling should be easy, right? You have a product or a service, and, you think that it solves somebody's problem, and marketing really should just kind of connect, a seller with a buyer. So in like a perfectly kind of rational world, this would be pretty simple. A rational consumer would always buy the most technically advanced product within their specifically, defined budget. And all you really need to do is just sort of put out a list of your product's technical specifications and the price, and just sort of watch the sales come in. But the real world is, of course, not at all like that, right? And behavioral science has studied the eccentricities of consumer psychology for decades, and the knowledge that exists there can and should be an essential part of that sort of marketing strategy. So behavioral science can be incorporated in a variety of ways. The psychology of the target consumer, though, should be the starting point. So like any other business strategy, selling things or marketing things fails when it's insular and top down, rather than focused on the customer or the user and bottom up. And so, starting by understanding the needs and the challenges of, the folks that you're trying to help or provide a solution to, independent of the product or the service that is being sold, should be the foundation of that strategy. So for instance, a lot of times organizations use the same marketing channels just based on sort of their level of comfort or familiarity, as opposed to sort of the preferences of their consumer. And then, with a sufficient understanding of that target consumer, you can leverage the vast amount of behavioral science literature that's relevant to a lot of the common problems that we see when you're developing messaging and ad campaigns and prompts that are meant to sort of promote some specific behavior. So you often don't need to really like reinvent the wheel. You can build on things that have been successful before, both from academia and from experiments that you've run within your own organization. All right, this is the third of our four kind of big where do organizations use behavioral science, and each of these kind of feel to me like sort of mini lectures in and of themselves. You can kind of build out a whole sort of lecture on each of these. So so I've tried my best to kind of condense them into what I thought were sort of the key points. this is something that I've worked in a lot. These are just sort of common areas of application for behavioral science in human resources. So, you know, oftentimes we're trying to convince an employee to use benefits that are offered to them. So saving more for retirement or healthcare benefits, looking to improve and, you know, maybe de-bias the recruiting and hiring process, help people sort of live a healthier lifestyle, helping them, you know, with their own professional development, sort of setting goals and, you know, learning for themselves. And then things focused on their own performance, so their performance within a role, and then, you know, how they're compensated for that. So the incentives and, you know, bonuses that might be offered within an organization. And, you know, there are some HR teams that, you know, I think do a good job of this, but there's a lot of opportunity to apply behavioral science in this area. A lot of the assumptions that people make about human behavior and decision making when they're kind of creating company policies or these sort of internal policies are pretty outdated, or at the very least incomplete. And so, you know, it leads to the design of programs that they might be well intentioned, but they, you know, don't capture somebody's attention, or they overlook constraints that people have on their, you know, time that they have to participate, or their, you know, ability to participate. Or, you know, the thing that probably happens the most often that I see is they tap into the wrong kinds of motivation. So, you know, you try to provide an extrinsic motivator to something that is really kind of more aligned with intrinsic motivation, or vice versa. You know, you try to get people to, you know, work longer or sort of sacrifice more, and you're using kind of intrinsic motivation to that end instead of extrinsic. So behavioral scientists can help here by guiding the design of programs to ensure that they work for, you know, as we said kind of at the outset, like real people. And real people are busy, right? They're overwhelmed, they don't have time to read your emails. And so, you know, a behavioral scientist approach would take some of this into account. And, you know, behavioral scientists are also informed of the literature around motivation and behavior. And so there are lots of principles and, you know, areas of research that can help improve, you know, engagement programs or human resources programs by infusing behavioral design. And as with these other areas, you know, research is and measurement is a valuable component as well. Sort of say, before you make this big investment, let's sort of make sure that that it's proving to be valuable. You know, as with the other areas, there's some things to kind of keep in mind. So one is that, you know, you will need some supports and data for, you know, some kind of intervention or experiment to actually do the measurement. And that can be sometimes hard to get in different organizations. Ideally, you'd be working on a team with, you know, potentially other behavioral scientists, but also data scientists, you know, and HR professionals who are familiar with your organization's current investments in employee engagement. So, you know, how is the compensation and reward structure set up, and why is it that way, and how long has it been that way, that sort of thing. And, you know, finally, the effectiveness of these initiatives is often going to depend on the will of executive leadership. And so, you know, a lot of companies kind of talk about wanting to build an amazing culture, but, you know, in practice, there are very few that, you know, seem to be kind of adventurous enough and sort of willing to invest the resources that it takes to do so. And that can be especially true of folks that have sort of a kind of carrot and stick mentality of motivation. So, you know, if we're wanting to get our employees to do something, well, we either pay them or we punish them. So those are folks that can often sort of not understand what a behavioral scientist might be trying to do there. And then the last area that we'll talk about is innovation. This is the area that I probably know the most about just from my kind of past work. And so I've been trying to cut as much out of this as possible because I realized it was so much longer. And I was like, I think it's just longer because I know more about it. So I think that, you know, at its core, innovation really kind of consists of 5 sort of functions, right? So generating, assessing, designing, launching, and scaling ideas. And you're sort of taking these things from kind of just being an idea to actually having some kind of impact for you or for your organization. And there are things like hackathons, crowdsourcing, startup incubators, accelerators. These are all examples of tactics that might align to some of these broad functions. And a behavioral scientist's expertise in shaping human perception and behavior can support all of these. Lots of organizations will have their own sort of version of this. I think that in general, it kind of, they'll have different terms, and oftentimes it's sort of like, this is our proprietary, whatever, or our fancy version of this, but at its core, it typically kind of follows this same path. So from a strategic perspective, a behavioral scientist can help design and build your innovation infrastructure and processes in a way that facilitate the key behaviors that move innovation from idea to impact. So for starters, having a process in the first place. One of the key tenets of behavioral science is that if you want someone to exhibit a behavior more frequently, you should make it easier for them to do, right? And so having an innovation process and the thoughtful introduction of some tools can decrease friction at key moments to make it easier to share and shape ideas, typically at the top of the innovation funnel. So in this kind of idea collection and assessment phase. And then as ideas enter and move through this process, a behavioral scientist can help you build your infrastructure for operational transparency. So, incubating innovations takes time, and a common concern that you hear from people who share their ideas, we'll call them innovators within the organization, is they'll say something like, "Hey, I shared my ideas with you like 6 months ago, and you haven't done anything with it." And the case may be that there's lots of people that are working on it, but without that kind of peek behind the curtain of what's happening, people kind of can lose confidence or lose patience. So greater transparency and kind of showing the work that's going on behind the scenes can improve those. And while that top of the funnel, that sort of idea collection phase might have very low friction to make it as easy as possible to surface ideas, as you move into that assessment phase, you'll probably start adding more friction back into the process. So, most of the time when we talk about friction, we talk about reducing it to make it easier for somebody to do something. But in some cases, it can actually be beneficial to increase friction, right? And so that's the case here, where we're sort of assessing ideas for innovation, where there's a need to ensure that really just the most promising ideas, the ones that have sponsorship within the business, move forward to design. And so, this might be, a requirement to create a business case, or you do a pitch session, or some other mechanism to kind of vet ideas. And then after assessment, ideas move forward to the design and launch. I think that really this kind of goes back to the section on sort of building and selling products. I mean, it's a very similar kind of process here. And so, a behavioral perspective in those phases can lead to better adoption, more learning, and that can improve sort of the future initiatives that you might have as well. And then just one kind of final note is that within this sort of very kind of broad or general process map, there are lots and lots of different tactics and tools that you can use to help facilitate the flow of ideas. And a behavioral scientist can help advise on how to improve the process for your specific context, and can maybe even test out different approaches or different tactics to see which ones yield the most or the best ideas. So where there is a key decision or action, behavioral scientists can help assess and improve that outcome. So just a quick kind of recap of this sort of very big section of where do organizations use behavioral science. Some common areas of application. There are certainly more, but some common ones are, in consulting and operations, building and selling products and services, in human resources and employee engagement, and in innovation. And generally, the sort of methods that we're using here are research, doing kind of different types of research or augmenting what you might already be doing, design, and then sort of testing and measuring to sort of make sure that we're having the impact that we want and that the investment is worth it. So this brings us to our final section here, which is how do organizations use behavioral science? And so, as organizations get sort of more mature, get excited about it, they tend to go through kind of these three sort of stages. At least the successful ones make it through all three. So the first one is you are educating and evangelizing. So this is, let's say you've just been hired into the organization, CEO thought, hey, I read Dan Ariely's book, or I went to Zarak's lecture and it was awesome. We should be doing more behavioral science. So we've hired you. You're our first behavioral scientist. Like, what should you be doing? So, early on, you want to be kind of, educating and evangelizing. So you're looking for sponsors within the organization. You're probably giving a ton of talks. It's really useful to sort of have like, kind of your intro to behavioral science and maybe a couple of behavioral science talks that are specific to whatever your organization does, because you're going to be doing these like all the time. Building tools and templates. So this is something that is kind of helpful early on when like you can't be doing all the project work yourself. And so having things that you can give to people that sort of boost their ability or increase their ability to apply behavioral science, or to sort of augment what you would be doing to make it easier for you to help them, is typically a win. But really the early stages of this is like creating excitement and buy-in from a bunch of different stakeholders, and building out your network of champions and ambassadors across the organization. And then you convert that excitement into the second phase of pilot and promote. And so, find a sponsor that is, can be a great sponsor for one of your projects, and, sort of build your portfolio of kind of demonstration projects that you're doing. And the goal here is, you're now sort of like driving demand for more of these projects. And, your focus here is on sort of broader storytelling, and demonstrating impact. So you sort of, that you're successful at this stage, or you're ready to move forward when you're getting asked to do more than you can do. And this is sort of where you think about, okay, how do I increase the capacity of this organization to use behavioral science? And so there are a couple different ways of doing this. And one is to hire a bunch of behavioral scientists, right? So we're going to do more projects. Well, I'm going to need 5 more people or 1 more person or whatever. That could be you sort of hiring them to your team. That could be you're sort of placing people with behavioral expertise in other roles. So I've done this before and it's been very successful. So, if you've got a great partner and like a data science team or a marketing team, when they're hiring for new roles, like funneling them people who, are marketing experts or data science experts, but also know behavioral science. You're sort of placing allies, across the organization. A great investment early is sort of building out the infrastructure that lowers the cost of running experiments. Early on, if some organizations already do run lots of experiments, but they're not that many, and they can be really time consuming. And if people aren't used to it, they can be kind of frustrating. And sometimes, right, they don't work, right? Like we learned something, but it's like, oh, well, what we were hoping would happen didn't happen. So you want to kind of make sure that, or you want to invest in things that make it easier to test more ideas, to run more experiments, so that you can really have kind of a portfolio of things going on at any given time, and not like, this is my one project that I'm working on right now. And then, depending on, where your organization is at, you might partner with experts or academics to run more complex projects. This is a lot of what my team at Duke does, is sort of partnering with folks to sort of help them when they have more kind of complicated things that they're trying to do. So we'll kind of dive into all of these. And there's sort of three kind of broad categories of how organizations use behavioral science that sort of align to these different parts of the of that kind of maturity map. So hiring and organizing a team, choosing the right projects, and then developing this maturity around research. So in hiring and organizing a team, there's kind of three structures that we see. And one is that, what I kind of described at the beginning of that process. You're an individual contributor. I kind of like to call it like a lone wolf. And you're there sort of on your own, and this person, these people are kind of unicorns. Like, they're really hard to find who can do a good job in that role, because this is where you sort of hire one expert who works across the entire business. And so in addition to understanding just the core behavioral science content, they are also probably going to need to know a lot about the industry itself, like what your organization does. And they're going to need to know about a wide variety of behavioral science. So they can't know just behavioral economics and nudges. They're also going to need to know a lot of social psychology. And they're also going to need to know how to run experiments. So they need to have expertise in measurement and sort of the research process itself. And, more than that, this person is often not just a researcher, but they're kind of a champion. They're sort of a translator for behavioral science. So they're spending a lot of time going out and like building that momentum, giving all those talks. So they need to kind of be like a charismatic person as well. It's very hard to find somebody that sort of fits the bill for all of these things, what we see is that, organizations may start with that, but that's typically not the ending point. There are some organizations where just having one person might be a good fit, but typically we see that if you sort of demonstrate value as a sort of individual contributor, you end up your organization ends up kind of growing the behavioral science function, and it goes in one of two directions. Either this sort of centralized team where you're now like the chief behavioral officer and you've got 10 behavioral scientists and data scientists that work for you, or this integrated function where you still might be kind of like a senior behavioral science person within the organization, but there are also people who have behavioral science expertise that live within different functions. So they might live on the data science team or on the marketing team. And so, that centralized team is kind of more of a traditional approach where you've got, you work really closely together, you have regular group meetings, you've got shared goals, you might even have, work from the same office. And depending on the focus of the organization, you might sort of have a lot of overlap in your training and skill sets, or you might sort of have a more diverse set of skills to kind of complement each other. And then the integrated function is where, you're sort of placed across the organization, and typically that means that you are not, if you're working on that team, you're responding to or you're responsible to not like the chief behavioral officer, but you're responsible to like the VP of marketing or to your product manager. And that function also like pays for your you to be on the team and all of that. So there are trade-offs to each of these, but it sort of depends on what your organization is trying to achieve and how it's trying to use behavioral science that you decide which of these you end up kind of going with. Once you have at least one behavioral scientist, you have to kind of figure out what projects you're going to do. And so in choosing the right projects, the first step is identifying a compelling executive sponsor. So this needs to be somebody that can really clear a path for you, because oftentimes if you're the first behavioral scientist, you're not really like, you're kind of just like off by yourself, And so you don't necessarily have the authority to drive or change a roadmap somewhere. And you need a sponsor that sort of says that make this a priority, when this person in this behavioral science role suggests something or wants to work with you, like make time to do it. So finding an executive sponsor is important, and then developing, a compelling business case. So I think a lot of times organizations, especially companies, are worried that, a behavioral scientist, I think because scientist is in the name, is just going to like do research for the sake of research, and they're not really thinking about like the outcomes for the business. And so having a compelling business case where you're working on, a problem or an opportunity that's really important to the business is important for your success too. That can often occur where there are these sort of triple win opportunities. So it's good for the business, it's good for your customers or consumers or users, and it's good for sort of society overall. These end up being stories that, or they end up being projects that turn into great stories that you can tell sort of, publicly at events and that sort of thing too, or put in your marketing. And then, you can leverage this success or those success stories to generate demand and build the case for that bigger capacity. I think, let's see, everyone can you see my screen? Yeah, cool. I just got a little note about it, so just double checking. Thanks. Some things to avoid. Becoming a figurehead who just gives presentations. So this is definitely something that I've seen a lot, and is sort of not a great place to be in. Spreading yourself too thin, where you get just asked to do lots of different things and you sort of can't really like focus on anything or really demonstrate impact, that's a pitfall that we see a lot. Focusing exclusively on like really long-term projects or just really kind of simple A/B tests. You want to have some sort of balance there where you're sort of demonstrating impact and you've got a bunch of things that are sort of these incremental innovations, as well as sort of longer term, bigger swing, like value, projects for the organization. You don't want to get pigeonholed into just doing trainings. So providing people with kind of general information about behavioral science is good, but you're not going to turn everybody in the organization into behavioral scientists in like 2 hours worth of training, right? So I think of it as like kind of like a graphic designer, right? So everyone should be able to like put together a decent presentation, right? But like there are times when we just need a graphic designer, and so we'll call a graphic designer. So I think that it's like you give people like the base level of information of what they need, but they're going to need an expert at some point. So you're not going to turn them into experts in just 2 hours. And then working on projects where you can't measure the impact. So you might start off by kind of measuring things in, milestones and outputs, but those need to pretty quickly turn into impacts. And then finally on this path, developing research maturity. So the good news that, I think I like to deliver to organizations is that you probably already conduct research, right? So, on the kind of research journey where we move from exploration of sort of what's happening to explanation of why is this happening, most organizations are doing some kind of exploration or exploratory research, right? Like what's happening, right? That's like if you have a dashboard or if you get, like a regular report on something, like you're probably doing descriptive research, maybe relational research, right? So, what percentage of our patients have been vaccinated, or what's the typical user flow through our new app? This is kind of descriptive research, and lots of organizations are doing that, right? So just what's happening. This relational research, is sort of, okay, well, let's look at a couple things and tell me how are these things related, So do people who use coupons have smaller or larger baskets, than those who don't? And then, this is all kind of building towards sort of the causal research, which really sort of means like running an experiment. And that's kind of where a lot of behavioral scientists bring a lot of value to the organization. It can be helpful to sort of know like what phase is your project even in. A lot of times, people might run to an experiment a little too quickly. And so some of the signs that you're still exploring is just, well, we're not really even sure what the right question is to be asking, or we're just kind of got a bunch of ideas, but we don't really have any sort of sense of priority yet. And you're probably ready to start running an experiment if you've got a pretty clear set of options, and you just need to know which one is the best one to go with. So kind of there are different tools that you use for each of these. So if you're still in this exploratory phase, you're going to use the tools that the organization typically does of kind of secondary analysis, observational studies, surveys, interviews, that sort of thing. And then when you're looking to confirm things, you're more in this realm of experimentation. The last little note here is just sort of, I won't read through all of this, but I'm happy to kind of provide this as a little takeaway for folks if they're interested, which is just sort of an ethics checklist. And these are kind of driven partly by what like a IRB would do. So if you're in academia, like the ethics review that you would go through, like some things from that, as well as just sort of some kind of common practices that we see as well. So with that, thank you very much. This was great, and I look forward to kind of the conversation that we'll have. I don't know, Flavia, should I reveal our bonus gift and everything now, or do you want to do it later?
Oh, I think so. I think they would like to know, and then we can begin with the questions.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. So thank you so much for listening. So we have a gift for everyone, which is that, well, I shouldn't even say we, basically this is like Flavia and team have a gift for everyone, which is that they have translated our book that this presentation is based off of into Portuguese. And so it is it's with our designer now. It should be ready within just the next couple of weeks. And so if people are interested in that, I will put a little sign up link in the chat, and you can just probably see some random part of my screen until then.
And I want to add really fast, Zarak, that both translators, Jani and Patricia, they are here. So you can, Patricia have already met, yeah? So
yeah, great to see you again.
And Jani, it's a lot. It's a book, I think 90 pages. I don't remember how many pages, but it was a very special gift from them to us, because Zarak's book and all the organization that's involved, it's so nice, and we don't have many things in Portuguese. I think the behavior economics guide was 2015. So Jani led this initiative of translating. You all have access, it's for free. It's just for us to expand the knowledge, this knowledge in all of the sectors here. And Zarak, we have people here from everywhere, like even leaders in the public sector, in the private sector. And so I think it will be helpful for many of them.
Well, I am super excited and very grateful to you for translating it. And so, yeah, I put the link in the chat there, and you'll see there are sort of two places here. So this is the English version, so you can download that one now if you want. And then this is to sort of sign up for the Portuguese version. So we'll send this to you when it is ready, which should be in just like a week or two. So we are very excited about that. And then one other little kind of fun thing is, if you want, we're thinking about maybe kind of redesigning the cover a little bit. And so if you want to vote on what you would like the book to look like, I will put that here as well.
Oh, a special cover for the Brazilian version, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you could still choose the sort of one that we did before if you kind of particularly like that one. But I mean, I kind of like the idea of a special cover for the Brazilian version. But if people sort of want it to look the same, I think that's fine too.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Thanks a lot, Zarak. Thanks a lot for letting us translate all this, a lot of information. I know you were very careful with each chapter, detail, information there. So you did the hard job of collecting all this. So thanks for letting us translate to Portuguese. Yeah.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can have a small idea how hard should have been. Yeah. Of gathering all these people. And then for the questions, Ju, you are the one that's gonna start with the questions.
I can start. So Zarak, thank you very much for this thorough and so practical presentation. I have to say, I mean, many of our questions were already answered. So thank you very much. Super rich. So my first question to you will be on the measurement. I mean, you mentioned it was interesting to hear one of the tips at the end. You mentioned not to spend too much time in very thorough experimentation, but also not to, I mean, keep on doing only simple A/B testing. So it's very, very difficult to get the right balance, right? Yeah. And one of the things we struggle within our area is exactly this. The golden standard is RCTs. And they are very, I mean, normally it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources as well. So from your experience, could you share with us, I mean, some practical examples on how to try to get that balance? I mean, not spend too much time, like 2 years in one RCT, but also not doing simple A/B testings. Do you have, I mean, practical example from organizations that you have already seen that you can share with us?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think it sort of goes back to kind of like building, I think, a network of sponsors or partners within an organization. So where I've seen this be successful is, and I guess the way that I've thought about it is almost like an innovation portfolio. So a typical innovation portfolio of projects within a company is, you know, somewhere between 50 and 60% of the projects are incremental innovations. This means that, you know, you are adding a new feature or something like that to a product, but you typically know, you have a pretty good idea of how much it's going to cost. You have a pretty good idea of how long it's going to take. You have a pretty good idea, or at least a good guess, as to what the benefit of doing it is going to be. You know the team that's going to do it, and you sort of, probably work directly with that team to kind of get it done. You then have sort of a slice of your innovation portfolio, and I think of this for like an experiment portfolio as well, that are, we'll call like adjacent innovations. So this is where, you're taking an idea that exists somewhere else and you're, trying it, in your market or in your organization, or you're taking something that you do really well and you're taking it to a new sort of segment of users. So again, you have some information about it, right? You kind of know generally how much it's going to cost, but it's probably going to be a little bit more expensive than these incremental things. You probably have some sense of the timeline, but it's going to be a longer timeline than, an incremental kind of A/B test. And, you have some sense of the benefit, but, you could be surprised that it's a lot higher or a lot lower than what you thought, right? And that is typically, somewhere between 20-25% of, or 20 and 30% of your portfolio. And then the last piece is sort of transformational innovations. And these are like big swings. No one's done this before. You're inventing a new technology, or you're doing something for the first time. And so, the timeline, there are way more unknowns, and it's probably more expensive. You're not really sure of what the benefit is, but like sort of like if it works, it would be, massive. And this might be like introducing a new business model or, a new technology or something like that. So I think that I kind of translate that to experiments as well, where, the bulk of what you do is typically, things where you've got a pretty clear idea of what the value is going to be. and you have a pretty clear idea of who's going to do it and how long is it supposed to take. And so, if you're just showing up on sort of day one and no one has thought about this at all before, like you probably have some work to do, just kind of building the infrastructure to even start running those types of tests and, kind of putting that sort of knowledge management in place and all that stuff. But if someone has already kind of done that a little bit, like a product team has already started doing that and you're sort of joining to kind of augment, there are things like that within the organization that you can take advantage of. And then you can sort of, kind of come up with your own ideas or build out that portfolio with these sort of bigger swings. So for instance, an organization that I worked with ran field experiments as well as sort of digital kind of A/B tests. And just sort of by their nature, a lot of field experiments just took longer, but they answered sort of more important questions, or like just bigger questions. And so, we, for instance, we could run, a digital test in, just a couple of days, basically. And, at first, those experiments generated like pretty good, results or impressive results. But that was basically because like, it was essentially just fixing problems. It wasn't really like optimizing. It was just kind of like, oh, there's like 50 clicks to do this thing. Like you could turn that into 3 clicks, you almost don't really even need to run an experiment. You're just kind of like, well, this is definitely going to be better. The field stuff took a lot longer, but for my favorite one of these was we tested an idea that was related to like the endowment effect. So it was like, oh, if we give somebody something, they're gonna, value it more. And so it had to do with sort of an incentive. And it was like, when do you provide this to someone? Do you kind of dangle it out in front of them and say, hey, you should work really hard and I'll give you this? Or should you give it to somebody and then say, you should work really hard to keep this? And so, the experiment was pretty complicated and it ran for, the better part of a year. And it was, at the outset, it was like, this is a great idea. Like we thought it was a great idea. We're like, well, endowment effect sort of replicates in all these different places. Like it's probably going to be a good idea. We were working with, some academic partners that are, very smart, and we're like, they were excited about it. Our field partner, which was this sort of massive manufacturing organization, they were so excited about it. They were like, well, we don't even want to run an experiment. Let's just roll it out to everybody. And we were like, well, it's kind of our whole deal. So we have to like run experiments. And so when we, kind of at the end of that experiment, when we looked at the results, we see is like, okay, for our treatment group, they sort of got this endowment thing, like their numbers went up, which is great. But because we ran it as an experiment and we had a control group, we see like, oh, their numbers went up as well, even higher. Like the whole market was going up. And so when we sort of extrapolate out, like, well, if we had done this just sort of as like, well, let's just roll it out, it's a great idea, instead of let's do a smaller pilot and kind of test this first, the estimate was that the organization would have lost $1 billion in a year. And not only that, they would have been happy about it, because they would have thought, oh, these numbers went up, right? You would lose $1 billion and never even know it. So I think that, there's that story is sort of much more compelling than, well, we ran an A/B test on the sign up page and, we took 50 step clicks out and all of a sudden it's better. You tell that story to someone to kind of try to build momentum, and they're like, who put 50 clicks here in the first place? This is a terrible design, and like, okay, well, yeah. So you don't get a lot of credit for just like going in and kind of fixing things that, just should have been kind of different to begin with. But this sort of counterintuitive, like, well, everyone thought this was a good idea and thought this would work. And in the end, because we sort of went through this process, we sort of avoided this huge kind of failure. That was a much more compelling story.
Thanks, Zarak. Guilherme?
Yeah, thank you, Zarak. That was a great story. Fascinating, actually. I have another question for you, more regarding behavioral insights organizations, behavioral insights teams within organizations in terms of where do they sit or they initially sit into organizations. We have seen both in public and in private sectors that the behavioral team or the behavioral person, like the lone wolf, if that is the case, they usually sit on the innovation somewhere nearby the innovation area or the innovation group or the innovation team I mean, I would like to sort of listen to your thoughts on why would that be, and which are potential advantages or risks in that, especially in terms of how do you sort of grow out of the innovation area and becomes more entrenched in the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that that they often start in innovation areas because innovation is another one of the few areas that is cross-cutting across the organization. So when you think about, well, where can you use behavioral science? That's why I had to cut down all the slides from the talk. Like, you can use it everywhere, basically, right? Like, oh, do you have a problem where people are doing something they're not supposed to do or not doing something they're supposed to do? That happens in all the parts of an organization, right? So, so innovation is often tasked with, come up with ideas, and sometimes, in most cases, they're sort of external facing, but it's not uncommon for innovation teams to focus on internal stuff as well. And so they have sort of a broader mandate than lots of other teams. So I think that's part of it. But I think that's almost like an afterthought. I think the main reason is because people are like, well, innovation is like cool. Behavioral science is like kind of new and cool. So we'll just put these things together. It doesn't really fit naturally anywhere else. So the only other thing that I've seen is like it be just sort of a standalone, like part of kind of like an executive team. So for instance, when it started in government in the UK and in the US, it started as, within the office of the prime minister or within the office of the president. So it started as part of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in the US. And then eventually it kind of graduated, right? So that turned into now the Behavioral Insights team, which is this sort of quasi-governmental consultancy, right? Or I guess they wouldn't even say that anymore. They're like fully kind of a nonprofit separate entity. But and then in the US, it has sort of evolved to be in the General Services Administration, which is like a very bland, it's sort of like this agency that most Americans have never even heard of. And it basically controls like just a ton of things within the sort of like the operations of government. And so they found their way there eventually, right? And kind of are more embedded. So, I think that the risk of it is that innovation teams, it's sometimes hard to set up decision rights and ownership of, okay, well, what parts am I going to be helping with? And then when does it turn into something for somebody else? So is it that, the innovation team is going to be creating like new products and sort of spinning them out? And so you have a behavioral scientist that's sort of like going with them from sort of like ideation to you're launching this thing and it's like out in the market now? Or does it at a certain point, like, it's incubated by the innovation team, but then it sort of moves into, some other part of the business? So that's like a kind of broadly, like, I think the problem of, or like a struggle of just sort of the way that innovation is often set up within organizations. And so that can be sort of a challenge for behavioral science teams as well, is like, to what extent do we have centralized sort of ownership of this? And if so, that means that we need to be able to not just sort of go to the product team and say, hey, like you could change these features, or go to the marketing team and say, you could really revamp and do this marketing in a different way. You need to have some sort of ownership of that, right? So either that means that you are sort of doing maybe kind of, working on projects that are incubated from the rest of the business. And those are often projects that are kind of transformational new business models. They're a threat to the current, business units. And so, you kind of have to keep them separate. Or you start to embed people, and there are different ways of doing that. Some of them you kind of maintain sort of a centralized structure, but you are, loaning people out to different projects, or you sort of scope out a project and okay, you're like dedicated to that for the next 3 months or 6 months. Or, as you say, you end up with sort of this more kind of distributed, model where you've kind of outgrown the innovation team, and you have people that are kind of placed in different areas, and they sort of are just part of the product team and part of the marketing team. And so in a way that I think is a sign of success. Basically, I mean, the sort of ultimate revealed preference in these things is like, is somebody going to pay for this or not, right? And so when you're in an innovation team, oftentimes, the business units aren't paying for your time. It's paid, or not directly anyways, it's sort of paid indirectly. And so, a team, like a product team saying like, whoa, what you're doing is so valuable that like, I want to hire somebody, like I want to hire you to come here, or I just want a behavioral scientist here, I think is a sign of success.
Great, thank you.
Great question.
Great, Zarak. Yeah, I'm gonna take a question from the chat from Gabriel. Gabriel, would you like to make the question, or would you like me to read it?
Yeah.
Perfect.
I've been thinking about. Hi, my name is Gabriel.
Hi.
And recently, the behavioral economics guide was published, and right at the introduction, John Leeds talks about something he calls the voltage effect. That is a problem that happens once you scale an intervention. I mean, once you are you make your control group and your tests and your treatment groups, but once you scale it, the results tend to change. I mean, they could get higher than anticipated or lower. And he talks about that. I want to know about more about this voltage effect and how this affects big organizations.
Yeah, well, I'll right off the bat admit that you are better read on this than I am, Gabriel, because I have not read the most recent behavioral economics guide yet. But I'm familiar with the sort of the effect that he's described here. And I'll give you my sort of quick and potentially uninformed opinion on it. So I'll caveat what I'm saying with that. But I think that oftentimes, the interventions that we develop are very contextual. And so when they scale up in some way, I mean, and maybe this is slightly less true for digital products, but when they scale up in some way, like we lose some of that context, or it gets kind of noisier. And so it tends to sort of like the effects just kind of, I mean, sometimes they can be amplified, but in other cases they sort of like kind of, modulate out. So yeah, I think that is part of it, is that, we don't often appreciate how contextual some of these things are, or the impact when you sort of roll it out to broader people. And it depends on sort of like how, I guess, you go about measuring this. In some cases, you might have like your sort of population sampling done right, but like the context that they're operating in, right? If it's not sort of like a kind of pristine lab environment, right? You sort of lose some of this. So so yeah, no, so I think that could be part of it. And then the other thing that I've seen, or that I've kind of been thinking a little bit more about, is that oftentimes we are measuring average effects across the population, and so we there are interventions that they might be great for some people and terrible for other people, and so on average we're like, well, there's nothing going on here. There's a lot going on there, right? And so that I think is maybe could be part of it as well, but sort of like, I think that the field might move towards a little bit more sort of nuance around both of those things, kind of like nuance around context. I think that's especially true just driven by like kind of replication stuff. I had a conversation with Rory Sutherland from Ogilvy. We recorded a podcast with him when his book Alchemy came out a couple of years ago. And he had this really kind of, I thought, great anecdote of like, well, he's great for anecdotes, but he had a great anecdote about like, you know, the JAM study and like, oh, it's like hard, it doesn't replicate the JAM study now. He's like, well, yeah, sure. Like if you're like really busy and you're like, you know, trying to get home, like feed the kids or whatever, and you're like going through the grocery store, like maybe this doesn't, it loses some of this effect. But if you've like just driven 2 hours outside of the city to go to some mega store called World of Jam, like you're probably super excited about jam, right? You're probably going to buy a lot of it. And so, you know, I think like the context is sort of is very important. And then, you know, I think like the differences and effects based on sort of differences in sort of the population is important as well. So that's a very long answer to sort of say, I don't really know that much about that.
But can I add to that and have your opinions, Zarak? Gabriel is also from at IBL as in Behavior Lab, but the question of Guilherme, he said about innovation, the innovation teams. What in our experience in Behavior Lab, when the project comes from the innovation area, is usually better because sometimes it's comes from the market research area. So they just want like a straight to the point answer, like, yeah, hypothetical research, the budget is lower, and they're not sometimes, because the methodologies in behavior design, it changes as you have the scope, the problem scope, and then you change the methodology through the phases, yeah, what we really need. And there is not no bullet proof. But the one thing, the question of Gabriel of innovation area and Gabriel's about the voltage effect. The problem sometimes you do a very nice field experiment, randomized control trial, and you design the product and everything in the innovation area and goes to the field with the innovation area. And then when that major product that does exactly the same and goes to a normal area, a product owner or another area in the company that the eyes are not all in that step by step, the consulting is not with them, they have other major problems to solve. So I think also this happens because sometimes it's innovation that's amazing, yeah, that's our area is innovative and things, very nice things are built from that. But what one nice thing is when it comes from the innovation area, for us at least, we are more free. Yeah, the scope of the problem, how many months, how many weeks will take, who will be in this project, which areas we will invite to be with us in that project. That's very nice. But then when you launch in the innovation area, the voltage effect is even bigger, yeah, because then not all the things stay the same when you are going to implement in the company. I don't know if that makes sense for you.
Yeah, you know, it definitely does. I mean, I think about, so, you know, I've, for the last like a couple of years, I give like a lot of talks, sort of like introduction to behavioral science talks. And, you know, I'll often do some kind of parlor trick, you know, sort of like you do like, basically I'll try to replicate a study with the audience. And so, you know, I've done this with like, if I speak at a conference, I'll sometimes volunteer to do like, well, instead of a talk, let me lead a wine tasting. And then I talk about anchoring and I, you know, replicate the, you know, an anchoring experiment with wine. And what I learned doing that is that there are lots of really like common ideas or behavioral principles, especially like behavioral economics principles. And maybe that's an important distinction to make too. Like, I don't know to what extent the voltage effect, again, because I haven't read it, is true of sort of some broader elements of, say, like intrinsic motivation. Like, is this true of self-determination theory as well, or, you know, as much as it is of like nudges. And so one of the things that I kind of realized when I started doing these talks and kind of like doing these little like, mini experiments was that, you know, I went back and read a lot of those papers and it was like, oh, like the specific like mechanisms that they use, like when they sort of were doing these lab experiments, was like, oh, I didn't realize that this was sort of the connection that of how this was sort of made, you know? And so I think to your point, like just sort of describing behavioral science principles or even handing off like a, you know, kind of MVP or a project plan or something like that, sometimes like the fidelity might get sort of lost a little bit, and it's sort of a field where the nuance is very important. So I could totally see that being the case or a contributing factor.
And yes, and as we believe the framing matters, yes, when we are there doing the project, like we ever talk about the project differently, when it goes to the day by day, implementing, the results are mixed, yeah.
Yeah.
There is one question, Ju, Guilherme, Artur, I didn't see in the chat, sorry, because I can't open the chat now, but about the book that we were discussing that we want to hear from you is that the book says behavioral science in the singular form, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Here in Brazil, we usually uses a lot of behavioral sciences, yeah? Ciências Comportamentais. But Patricia is here, one of our translators. We maintain behavioral science, but we wanted to see if there is anything to it, like why in the plural?
No, there is not a big, that wasn't me like making a big stand about something. And in fact, I actually asked this question to one of my colleagues just like last week, who, I don't know if this is significant, but he's Peruvian and he says behavioral sciences. And we were like working on a paper and I was like, I like added a comment to the paper and I was like, do we use plural or singular? Like I always thought it was singular. And he was like, oh, I always just use plural. And I was like, I mean, I agree. Like it is more than one thing. I use it as like an umbrella term to like include, you know, behavioral economics and social psychology and like all these other sort of disciplines. So yeah, I don't have a strong sort of like feeling about it that it's sort of, it has to be singular or plural. But yeah, it's funny. We had this exact conversation like a week ago where I was like, is it plural? I was like, I always thought it was, we said it's singular. And he was like, oh, I just always said it was plural. And I was like, well, I mean, I can see why. And he was like, well, no, I can see why you, and I was like, wow, I don't, it's already written. So just leave it as it is.
Okay, I think, I don't know, 5-6 people here participated in this discussion these days. So one of our hypotheses is that if you are talking in a book about behavioral science, it's like a science, it has one big umbrella, and when we call, and we here in Brazil, we do usually say behavioral sciences, it's always in the plural. It's the idea of trying to bring all the sciences together, so it's not one theory, one big umbrella, it's like a lot of them. That was the idea. Yes, Patricia, I don't know if you want to add to that, or Juliana, or...
No, that's it. And we have this discussion during the translation, and sometimes it wrote in singular and after that in plural. So you have to change, because in Portuguese you have a lot of changes when you use plural or singular. So
we like ran into that a lot at different places that I've worked as well. And so basically my only like kind of comment over the years has just been like, let's just be consistent within the same document. Let's be consistent, because I've worked with like marketing teams and stuff where it's like, we do like behavioral economics and we do behavior science, not behavioral, behavior science. We do, you know, just neuroscience. Some people just say neuroscience, and like it's all encompassing for all these things, behavioral or whatever. B-Sci. So I was like, look, that was what when we were like, so when I was editing the English version of the book, I did a lot of like search and replace, just like search and replace for any time anyone said, like, I think I changed it all to like behavioral science, singular. And it was like search and replace for any like random abbreviations. Some people say BSI. Oh, when you're like putting in a BSI in your organization, I was like, well, yeah, too cute. Just type it out, you know. It's digital version. We're not paying for that much paper, you know. So,
oh yeah, I totally understand. I remember now 10 years ago when we had the behavioral guide. Remember Guilherme from everyone here, Guilherme was the one, and we were translating, and we know it's a book, and we didn't know even there was no like fixed word even to prospect theory. Like we had to vote, like how
exactly.
So I remember Guilherme, and there were so many emails like yeah, there was, and many there are till today. There aren't like translator, but Jani and Patricia are amazing translators, Brazilian translators, suffered this for us. They chose for us, yeah, and then they will have. But I'm gonna pass to Artur, but I want just to reinforce everyone that Zarak did all the page, so you can add your email to receive the Brazilian version. Like it's not you're not gonna receive other things, and I'm gonna speak in Portuguese real fast. So just so, né, pessoal? Então, assim, com o Zarak a gente tem conversado, com a Patrícia, com a Jane, tudo do economiacomportamental.org. E aí a gente tomou todo o cuidado também para vocês não entrarem numa meia, como não, e a gente queria que estivesse pronto hoje, né, Paty? Corremos muito para isso. Não deu para ficar pronto hoje, mas ele criou ali só para a gente, né? Só para os brasileiros, tem ali para colocar o e-mail. Então, quem for para receber, colocar lá, que assim que a gente sair, já dispara direto para vocês.
Acabei de colocar o link de novo no chat. Isso. Mais
So,
uma vez, para não ter erro.
Duplicamos. Mas não deixem aí, porque o Zarak correu até para isso, né? Para ter certinho aí, falar, não vai colocar no mesmo. Então, fez a página aí para gente. I was just mentioning, Zarak, thank you very much that you did the link only for the Portuguese version and for everyone here that wants the book, yeah? So they should sign there.
Yeah, and we'll do, I'm sure we'll send it out on like LinkedIn or other things like that. So feel free to follow any of us there. I'm sure it'll pop up in the next like week or two. So yeah, very excited for it. It's just a wonderful treat. So I'm very grateful and appreciative of both that and for the invitation to meet you all today.
Thank you, Zarak.
Artur, a gente podia tirar uma foto, né? Eu lembrei agora da última vez, acho que muita gente já saiu.
We'd like to take a picture from everybody.
So please turn on your cameras if you can.
Now
is the time that everybody fixed hair.
Normalmente a gente avisa antes, né? Mas era para não deixar de ter aqui o... Vamos lá, mais alguém que quer entrar? Pena que muita gente já saiu, né? Mas 1, 2, 3 e... Eu mando aí para vocês, gente. Mas vai lá, Artur.
There you go. Zarak, once again, thank you so much for your presentation, for being here with us. It was a pleasure. It was a great talk. So thank you one more time. And once again, some people say that when you say things 3 times, that when you fix it better. So I'm going to invite everybody again to download Zarak's book. They're also going to release the book in Portuguese in a couple of weeks. So if you're not comfortable with English, you can download in Portuguese. It's a huge feature. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. It's great to meet you all and look forward to talking with you all again soon.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Zarak. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.